All right, ladies and gentlemen, this is John Wayne with JohnWayneGovernmentContracts.com and GrowMyBusinessQuick.com. People occasionally ask us, what type of clients do we have? What type of clients do we help? Freight companies, we have landscapers, we have construction companies, video production companies. One of our newest clients, Monica.Mack with M3T CX Authorities, could have probably prevented the Titanic from sinking. Now, if you don't know what the Titanic is, it was a ship that was built and was supposedly unsinkable, but it sank in 1912. And her business model is to look for problems before they happen, to prevent the problems from happening. So she most likely could have saved the Titanic from sinking had she been around at that time.
You know, it's called the Titanic. It was supposed to be unsinkable, but it wasn't necessarily the iceberg in all that sunk the ship and made it a disaster. There were multiple failures well before the ship ever left the dock. Hi, my name is Monica.Mack. I'm with M3T Commissioning. If you're not familiar with commissioning, we are risk management. That's how I generally describe it to an owner. We come in, we take a design from a designer, we take a look at it and review it. We review the construction team's work and we make sure that you get out of your project what you put into it. You need a third-party commissioning person because they are completely independent of the owner, of the designer, of the construction team, and they're going to come in and try and give you the best, honest, evaluation of your project without the biases and without the hindrance of being controlled by another entity. And that is something that a lot of larger construction projects need. You need someone to be able to come in and give an assessment that's not biased. And with the Titanic, a lot of the people that had to do with value engineering and the building, they all had a stake in it. And I mean, a wonderful stake. This ship was anticipated. It was, celebrated even before it had kind of slid into the dock. So no one was looking at the practicality of what was being done. Well, let me go back. Let's go back to value engineering. Value engineering, for those who aren't familiar with it, is a method that people use to prioritize the systems, their functioning, and what you don't need. Like, it's almost like creating and separating out a wish list from what is definitely needed. When something isn't value engineered correctly, you may value engineer out a safety item or something that is absolutely needed without knowing. The Titanic was designed with a space for everybody on that boat to get on a lifeboat. But because the priority at the time was money, I guess it does drive, the driving force behind this was money. They wanted their wealthier clients that had a view of the water to have an unobstructed view. And so the lifeboats actually obstructed the view for the passengers, so they took a lot of them off. Less than half of the passengers had no way to get off the boat when the lifeboats were value engineered off. They skipped a couple of safety trainings. If they had done the lifeboat training, I'm pretty sure they would have been aware that they were severely short of lifeboat seats, but also to how to properly deploy those lifeboats in a manner that could knock time off of getting those lifeboats off the ship. All of that stuff was omitted.
Sounds to me like if you'd been around when the Titanic was built, it would still be here.
Hey, we wouldn't have value engineered our lifeboats at least. Assigning priorities on a ship or on a building is very, very important. Let me give you an example beforehand. If you put in a generator in a hospital, there's a few systems that have to be accounted for. There is an emergency system, but even more important than that emergency system is what's called a critical system. So you go from a critical system, emergency system, normal power, and then you go to things that aren't important at all, like charging someone's cell phone. That's not important to a hospital. Now, when you assign equipment to
Right.
these systems, it's to save lives. So a critical system is something that can't go down. It's mission critical. You have to think of it as a hospital. Do you want the power to go off in the middle of a surgery? If you have a quarantine unit, do you want the HVAC to stop working and allow, contaminated air out into the rest of the hospital? Uh, you have to assign priority to your systems to make sure that your refrigerators don't go down, so your morgues don't get hot, things of that nature. Well,
Right.
the communication system on the Titanic was not assigned priorities. Now, what that means is that the captain was receiving messages, but the priority was messages between the clients, the guests on the ship, because the guests on the ship messages made extra money for the I think the telegram guys. So they would prioritize getting a message sent from a guest on the ship out before or in receiving it because it made them extra cash. They prioritized it over weather announcements and messages to the captain of the ship. And because of this priority, this backwards priority, there were numerous notifications that they were coming upon inclement weather, that there was an iceberg directly in the Titanic's path. Because of those messages not being prioritized, they never quite made it to the captain until it was late. Even the guys that were looking out for icebergs, they weren't actually able to see that they were approaching one until it was too late. They didn't have their binoculars, also. That was another, they weren't prepared that night for the job. But even more than that, the communication wasn't clear and wasn't prioritized. So making money was prioritized over the operation of that ship. And that was the most damning, I would say, snafu. Let's call it a snafu. We don't like to say problems in commissioning, but that was the most damning issue that came up, was the not prioritizing the communication on the ship properly. And that could have been something that could have been caught in commissioning. Also, dissimilar metal was used on the hull. A hull of a ship is generally round. It has a lot of curves in it. It's not a lot of straightaways in there. Because of this, the rivets in the Titanic that were used were not the same metal as the hull itself. Say that I believe the hull was steel, and they had to use iron rivets in it because they couldn't drive the steel rivets in the curved part with the mechanism they were using to put the hull together. Well, dissimilar metals, especially if they're far away in their properties, corrode each other. So they will corrode at different rates. And as you will know, iron is a very corrosive. A little drop of water in a couple of minutes, you could see a little bit of rust. Even if you galvanize metal, which I'm not sure they were doing at that time, I doubt it, you would still have a weakened state in the boat because you did not use a similar metal all the way around. If you look up a picture of dissimilar metals, you will see that usually one metal, the weaker metal, is giving up electrons to a stronger metal. And because of that, you start to see corrosions and pitting and other visual signs of like degradation. So that was something that it doesn't have to hit water in order for that corrosion to start. And in a marine environment, metal corrodes at an accelerated rate, much higher rate than if it's on a dry or elevated area.
Well, we've known about dissimilar metals since the 1700s, right? They started putting lead on ships, and the lead is weaker than the metals and woods used in the ship, so the lead deteriorates before the wood does. It's we call it a sacrificial. Another prime example of dissimilar metals is
On the very first space shuttles that were launched, they used copper silver ionization, which was simply by putting an electrical charge from copper to silver, and in the process that actually sterilizes the water.
Right. And so this dissimilar metals, like you said, it's not always a bad thing. It can be used to your advantage, but in the way it was used this time, and don't get me wrong, iron and steel are pretty close in properties, but it still would weaken the hull to not come up with a better way to drive steel into steel, which would have given you that seamless, tight hull that was possibly indestructible. So understanding that there was a serious problem when the metals were changed and there was a problem with dissimilar metals on the hull to weaken the boat. There were multiple failures well before the ship ever left the dock. In the hull, the bulkheads were unsightly, so they lowered them. They were that sunk the ship. That's what sunk the ship. The bulkheads are there to contain the compartments that contain water, or they are supposed to contain water. The bulkhead is a very basic element of the ship to help keep it stable and floating upward.
So hindsight is 2020, but what you provide is foresight, which is priceless.
Yes, and like I said, you gain it from kind of being there. You go, you talk to trades, and there's a wealth of knowledge on any construction site by the people who work there, and I mean all of them. It doesn't matter what their job is or what trade they're tied to. If you talk to them and they've been there, they've seen things, safety issues. They've met people that didn't make it home safe, and they can tell you. And it's the actual interaction with all those people that give you the wealth of knowledge to help you build upon your commissioning career. It helps you build upon your commissioning knowledge, and not just the planning and the policies, but the actual building, the actual team building, the actual knowledge base of dissimilar metals. I learned about it by running into it.
Right. So our takeaway here.
Commissioning is not mandatory in many cities and states, and some owners might see it as simply an additional cost. But if they realized what commissioning actually does is prevents issues and problems from happening, prevents accidents from happening in the long run, then commissioning would have been an investment, not a cost.
I simply put it as risk management. And when you're putting your time and energy and investing, likely, whether it's thousands, millions, or billions of dollars into a project, you want all the proper safeguards you can get that you're gonna get what you pay for, that everyone's gonna go home safely from their job, and in the very end, that it's a usable facility. That's how you intended to use it. You can use a vacuum cleaner as a blower if that's what your design is, but you need to make sure that that you have someone there that makes sure that your design, if you put a vacuum cleaner up and you want to use it as a blower instead, that you need to make sure that that person has gone and talked to the designer, talked to the people who put it together, and knows what your goal is as the owner, to make sure that it's a blower, not a vacuum cleaner. I mean, and that's as an example, but it's risk management. It helps you mitigate your risk in that you've put up this money, that you're going to get exactly what you paid for. It doesn't matter what the design is. It doesn't matter what the construction team puts out. It fits your goal and it functions the way you intended it to function.
So the elephant in the room, the inherent thing is that obviously when the Titanic sank, there was loss of life. There was loss of everything that was on the Titanic, the furniture and the food. And that ship cost $7.5 million to build. And with inflation, that's around 200 million today. And on top of it, the $1 million of products and food and furniture, and who knows how much was lost. And they lost the ship itself. What does commissioning cost up front?
The upfront cost is usually less than 1.5% of a construction cost. It's not a very expensive cost when you think of the bigger picture, but it can be value engineered out if someone doesn't understand the real value of having someone there to be a mediator between all of the parties. And I do mean by that the trade people who don't necessarily speak the same language as the owner, or who doesn't speak the same language as the designer and engineering architect. They are generally talking it from a different point of view. So a commissioning team coming in can be a mediator between all those voices to help them all speak in one goal, speak in one voice.
You connect the dots.
Exactly, exactly. And if you do it correctly, you're actually building the team, because you're creating one goal and one standard to work by across a bunch of people that are doing separate things. It is a great exercise of team building.
Right, right. Well, I remember from my college days that the plumbers don't talk to the electricians. The electricians don't talk to the drywall guys. Everyone's a proud team of what they do, and to some extent, their team's better than the other. They're more important, if you will.
Right. I think I used an analogy of a door. I was explaining a Rex door. A Rex door is a door that has electromagnetic locks that open and close with electricity. So putting in a Rex door, it sounds pretty simple. It's a door, but it really isn't. You have to have the electrician in first. And the electrician is long gone before the door person actually installs that door into the frame. And then when he leaves, these doors have to run on fire sequences, active shooter sequences. So these doors are programmed by, say, by a fire protection team or a building automation systems team. And these people never meet each other. So therefore, someone does have to be there to, like I said, to close that gap where the electrician has to have this thing in perfectly in order for the next person to be able to perform their job to the best of their ability.
Is this something that is required in any areas or any states or cities requiring this at this point?
It isn't in effect the absolute law. There are states like New York that after the World Trade collapse, there was a call to commission and retro commission all new construction and any significant upgrades to any buildings, commercial buildings in New York City. So it is becoming a much more wider spread practice in certain states because of the benefits of doing it and to prevent, to help mitigate disasters. But there's also a push for green building and sustainability. And with a lot of those certifications, like the U.S. Green Build Council that certifies buildings LEED, there is a requirement for commissioning. And it's called enhanced commissioning, where the commissioning agent gets involved very early and helps in the design process all the way through warranty phase, or pre-design if you can.
But could also be called in after the fact when there's issues that were not resolved during the construction phase.
Yes, that, and in that case, it's usually called retro commissioning when, say, there was a building built and someone needs you to investigate and and retro commission could be called in for many reasons, not just because there's an issue. But yes, retro commissioning would generally involve something that is already there and it needs to be investigated and to find its best practices, to find what would be the best setup and the best maintenance plan for your building.
So much like forensic science, for example, when you would have to go in and do your research and determine what went wrong or what could go wrong, and then fix it, which would have been most likely, it would have definitely been cheaper to build it right to begin with than to go back and fix it later.
Yes. We had a client that once stated to us that they would pretty much build and pay for a construction project 3 times before we started commissioning for them. They would, pay for the first time, then they have to pay for all the corrections, and then they'd have to pay to put it in correctly again.
I think too, from my perspective, a takeaway is thinking that the Titanic happened, over 100 years ago. But right now, I think about the first people who are going to be in space commercially on,
Yes.
ships that have never been built before. And so there's
Yes.
a lot of marketing around who's going to do that first. And it kind of feels similar to what happened back then, when people are more interested in, getting there first. Well, I hope, this is my hope, is that people aren't more concerned about that than the safety, because it would be nice to be a part of that as like a space tourist, right? And the as long as you could trust the machines, even getting on an airplane, is kind of like, you hope that there's people that are in the world that can make sure that these things can be built safely. So for me, it's just that I'm very grateful for the work that you do as a consumer and as a traveler.
No, that's an excellent point, Davey. And I want to add a little bit to that. If we look at trial and error, we wouldn't have commercial space flight, most likely, if it wasn't for the Space Shuttle Challenger failing. And those astronauts losing their lives. It's a travesty, but that incident has made future travel better. The Titanic made ships safer, and you can take that and make future projects safer. I think commissioning, in my opinion, should be completely mandatory, 100%.
It is starting
Right.
to be a lot more prevalent. A lot of jurisdictions, there's states like New York, California, Colorado, who for many years have led the way um, in I would say in the commissioning field as a requirement, or using it, even when they didn't have to, as pushing it as a standard for construction sites. The government, especially the federal government, is starting to use commissioning a lot more on any project that it deems necessary, that is of a major, a major change, a major concern. If you're taking one permanent or semi-permanent thing and upgrading or moving. So it is starting to be a lot more prevalent. I do love commissioning, and I've learned to appreciate it because of the people that I've met in it. There's an inherent responsibility when you get into it to try and get pull the best out of the people in the project. You want to give your best, and you want your standards to be high, and it's also to help them do the same for themselves. Put your very best in, and you have a high standard, because we're going to back you up. We do represent the owner, but we also represent everybody else that comes on that site. And I do worry for their safety, and I do want their project to be something that the owner and themselves are proud of. And we do want to learn from our mistakes. There's a thing in construction called lessons learned, and in commissioning we keep track of those too. But lessons learned is where we went wrong, or things that didn't turn out exactly like we thought they would, but we keep track of them. So if we ever see it again, or if we ever run into that situation again, we can recall it. We can learn from that first time and say, hey guys, pull this out, switch it around, do it this way, because if you install it the other way, maybe in 5 years it'll go bad. There's a push to keep to incorporate it into construction now that is a lot more prevalent. Commissioning has only been mainstream maybe 20 going on 30 years. So it's still a very new industry, especially in the US. Outside of the military, they have a long history of commissioning, the Navy does. But I appreciate your thanks, but I also thank everybody that gives us the opportunity to come out and help us with those sites, to help us with these projects. We learn a lot, we meet a lot of people, and eventually we run into those people again. It's funny, construction can be small. It's funny how many times I've walked onto a site and saw someone I hadn't seen in years from a previous construction site, and we had a great experience working together, and we get to work together again. So it's an awesome job. It's an awesome industry to get into, and it helps make the general public safer. It helps make, it helps make the money worth the investment for a lot of owners.
They say that hindsight is 20/20. I think foresight is priceless. It must feel really good what you do, finding situations that could happen, preventing disasters, preventing loss of life, preventing accidents, which obviously saves money, but just knowing what you do could save a person's life must be really fulfilling to have that kind of job.
Right. It is. It's almost it's an honor to be able to be there and share and brainstorm with the greatest minds, because that's pretty much where it comes down to. If we come across an issue, it's not our job alone to fix it, because like I said, we're a part of a team. You get the owner's knowledge, you get the architect's knowledge, you get the trades knowledge, and it's not a competition, it's a team.
So in a nutshell, commissioning really protects the owner's interest, and it's there for the safety of everyone, not only the owner, but it's there for the safety of the crew, the construction crew, and the trades that are building, and of course the finished product. It's there for the safety of the employees and the customers as well, and most likely saving the owner money in the long run. It puts the liability on you to make sure that this is done right.
Well, yes and no. Everyone still retains their own liability for what they build, but what happens is it helps sort out liability. Now, as a designer or as an engineer, not everything that's engineered on paper can be built. So just because you got a set of drawings from an architect doesn't mean that it will build and be sustainable and safe for the public. So as a commissioning person, we don't take on the liability of the architect just because something was built. We actually go in and vet it and tell them, hey, this is not sustainable. This is not safe. So it actually makes sure that the liability stays with whatever party is responsible for whatever goes wrong. So it helps sort it out, actually. So say that you have a construction site and the owner's at fault. Say the owner didn't provide a safe environment. It sorts that out too. We do represent the owner, but it would be our job to make sure that we tell the owner that, hey, you need cones. Hey, you need caution tape. Hey, you need to make sure that your workers do not walk inside of an area, especially if they're not equipped with the proper equipment and clothing and to be in there. So it doesn't take on the liability as much as it actually makes it very clear who is liable.
Sure. And if people know their responsibilities and their liability, they're more apt to do things properly and not cut corners and just get her done.
It does force you in a way to take responsibility, because we do come out, we do check it. We have you sign off that you've built it as much as, like, when we're testing, we don't necessarily always go and test alone. We'll bring a contractor with us that's responsible for it. So you're there, you know what the issues are. We send you a copy of it in writing. It's not, it makes things solid and concrete and visible. And that's what hold your feet to the liability, to the fire of the liability.
How do you get involved with this kind of work, becoming a commissioning agent?
I started working in a military depot. So therefore we would get electronics from overseas and have to fix them, kind of forensically test them, look at them, fix them, and send them back. My first job out of college was in the Newport News shipyard commissioning submarines, crazy enough. So I came across commissioning in my first job out of college, and it was something I was unfamiliar with. I learned a lot about it, its naval roots, and commissioning for the Navy is extremely detailed, way more detailed than what we currently use as commissioning for the general public. And from there, I started to commission buildings and more common items outside the submarine. But the submarine was a great experience because it's like commissioning a city, a floating city. So it was an awesome way to learn a lot of different systems. But generally, I would say, though, if you want to be involved with commissioning, you don't have to have an engineering degree, which it helps. It definitely helps to understand the theories behind, the electronics, electricity, mechanical, physics. It definitely helps. But having a good rooted knowledge in trades and in construction science is a great way to start. Commissioning is something that can be picked up by the classes in your environment once you start a commissioning job. It's best to start from the ground up so you can learn all the nuances of it, because it becomes more than just understanding the equipment and how to test it. That is a very big part of the job, but it also is team building and understanding personalities. There's a lot of psychology to it. There is an understanding of contracts and business and scope of your contractors and mediation involved. So it does lend to a certain type of personality, and it does encompass a lot of everyday qualities people possess. So it's more important to kind of understand through like certifications. There are groups that will certify you for commissioning. It's good to get those general understandings and then go and spend your time on a construction site, because that's where you're going to get most of your knowledge, is actually being in there and doing it.
The hands-on approach.
The military does it a little different, because they actually have a board where you have to go and take a couple tests every few weeks and understand the systems. But honestly, spending time with the great tradespeople, talking to wonderful designers and architects, spending your time on the site and getting to know what the owner's needs are, the nuances of, hey, I work at a school and this school can't close, and so you have to be quiet during these times. You have to make sure you don't get dust out here. Getting to know those things about your site is probably where you're going to get your best knowledge, is just the experience of being there.
So the takeaway here is that if you know you're doing a construction project and you can hire a company that can help you prevent problems from happening, that is huge. I've heard construction companies say they paid for something 3 times because after they built it, they had to go back and fix it. After they fixed it, they had to go back and fix it again. And a commissioning company like Monica.Mack could prevent these problems from happening to begin with and save life and money. Critical. So if the owner of the Titanic would have hired a commissioning company like M3T CX Authorities, they could have most likely prevented the Titanic from sinking.